COVID-19 crisis to US-China relations. It is one of the most frequently discussed issues right now, especially after the initial shock of COVID-19 crisis and its impact to healthcare system, to economy. Now people are starting to discuss the potential impact of this crisis to US-China relations and on international system. So we have two excellent panelists. We have James Carafano, Vice President, Catherine Shelby Colum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy from the Heritage Foundation, and Matthew Krunig, Deputy Director, Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security from Atlantic Council. So gentlemen, I start with some general questions about the impact of COVID-19 crisis to international system. And in the second half of it, we will discuss more specifically on its impact on US-China relations. The first question is one of the questions that a lot of observers of international politics are discussing right now. Is COVID-19 crisis be transformative in the sense that will it change the international system? There are arguments people who say that it will be transformative in its impact on international system. There are those who argue that, well, it doesn't make it will not make a major difference. And there are those who argue that, well, there was already an existing transformation. The COVID-19 crisis will probably amplify the trends and expedite the transformation. So let's start with you, Matt. How do you characterize the impact of COVID-19 crisis to international system? You want to put yourself in one of those three boxes?
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation and for hosting this webinar. I'm delighted to participate. So I think I would put myself in one of the boxes, and I put myself in the box that I think this is not fundamentally transforming the international system, but it is increasing and exacerbating some of the trends that we saw in place already, including the return of great power competition. And as you and some of your viewers may know, I recently published a book on the return of great power rivalry. Thank you very much. And, I think that the beginnings of this crisis, some people thought, well, maybe this is an opportunity that shared threats like the coronavirus can bring great powers together to find solutions to global challenges. And instead, I think what we've seen is that this has just become a new arena in which this great power rivalry is playing out with disinformation, jockeying for power, mask diplomacy. And I think one of the other questions that we saw before the pandemic was a return to this question of which system is better, democracy or autocracy. With China's state-led capitalist model, is this a new, better model than the Washington model of open politics and open markets? And we've seen that debate has taken on new meaning in this era as well. So I'm in the third bucket. It's exacerbating trends that were already underway.
James? James, you are muted your microphone. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm anti-bucket, so I don't know which where I fit, but I will agree with Matt. Not just published a book on it, so we can't go back now. But we have, I think, entered the era of great power competition. I think that is a significant trend, really the most transformative since 1989, since the end of the Cold War. I think we all scrambled around for a framing network, certainly from the U.S. perspective. The U.S. place in the world, how we would use our power, how we would react to the rise of other powers. I think these are relatively open questions until a few years ago. And I do think there certainly is an American bipartisan consensus on this. I often point out that if you look at George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump's bad guy list, they look remarkably similar. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. Now, they have different ways of dealing with them, different ways of talking about them. They've had other things on their list. President Bush obsessed a lot about Saddam Hussein. President Obama put a lot of emphasis on climate change. President Trump puts a lot of emphasis on border security and economic independence. But fundamentally, there was a commonality there between three very different presidents from two different political parties spanning over a decade, in which there's a kind of a common American threat perception. I wouldn't overplay that exactly, but certainly that is replicated to some degree around key allies around the world. Certainly, if you look at it from the Russian-Chinese perspective, that seems to be an acknowledgement of that. Japan, Australia, India, even within Europe, that I think there's a recognition that this is some of a framing network or framing a framing concept. Certainly, Europeans. There's a lot of diversity in Europe. We're very uncomfortable about this, how they fit between East and West. But I think that is a dominant trend, and I don't think COVID derailed that. I would argue that as everybody's been hit by the virus and as they react to the virus, what we've seen is as they've come out of that, we're kind of picking up where we left off. So I would say two things just to close on that first thought. One is, I think much of the future competition will be shaped by who recovers first and fastest and best. So I think the pace of economic recovery may shape or change the future dynamic of great power competition. And it remains to be seen who does that. The other thing is I agree with Matt. I'm in the skeptic camp of the notion of COVID as a transformative concept. I mean, and you've heard this from many different quarters. People said, well, now we're going to implement the green agenda, for example, or now we're going to restructure all these things. I think the reality of getting our economies up and running outweighs all of that. And the notion that somehow we're going to enter major transformative projects when we're all trying to avoid the greatest depression since the 1930s, just not seeing that happening. I think, just as an example, I would point to the European recovery discussion, where we've kind of morphed into this notion that we're going to have a European recovery program. It's going to be bankrolled by Germany. It's going to be capped. It's probably going to be loans. It's not transformative. It's not forcing European countries to change their model. It's kind of perpetuating an existing system with some more debt. Doesn't really strike me as terribly transformative. So I'm in the camp that the next year is one that really we need to watch very, very closely to see how countries come out of the economic recovery and what they do with kind of their place in the race as they emerge and do that. Thank you.
Thank you. And second question about the international institutions. And this is another major issue, especially since President Trump suspended the funding for World Health Organization. But we have seen the failure of European Union in Italy and Spain specifically, which Brussels apologized about that. And we have seen that United Nations were really late actually to say something about the COVID-19 crisis. So there are a lot of questions about the function of international institutions and how the COVID-19 crisis will impact the future of these institutions. Do you think it will have another transformative impact on these international institutions, or would it be, for many people, turn out to be less relevant in terms of these global crises? Is it going to be continuously less and less relevant, especially after the, let's say, rise of the nation states in many of the Western democracies? Matt, let's start with you.
Okay, great. Well, I think this is another area where we've seen the crisis accelerate existing trends. So I think this rules-based international system that the US and its allies set up after 1945 has been remarkable in terms of providing peace, prosperity, and freedom around the world, but it was already coming under strain. It's not 1945 anymore. It's not 1991 anymore. The world has changed quite a bit. And one of the challenges is we've, to some degree, international institutions assume that countries are going to, for the most part, try to play by the rules. And I think what we've seen increasingly are some of these autocratic powers using these institutions specifically to really kind of undermine the purposes for which they were set up. And we're seeing this coronavirus with China using its influence within the WHO to mislead really the international community about the state of the pandemic. And then we see Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri raising questions about the WTO, another example where China is using its influence in international trade institutions really to systematically cheat rules. And so you have some people now, calling for an end to some of these UN institutions. Hawley calling for us to withdraw from the WTO. The Trump administration halting funding for the WHO. What I would argue is we really need a two-track system for reform going forward. So the first track is to continue to work within these UN institutions to reassert US and allied influence. But at the same time, I think there is room for creating new institutions with US allies, like-minded partners that work better, where you can have deeper cooperation among the countries that are really willing to play by the rules. Yes, I think institutions are being challenged, but that doesn't mean we cling to a dated system or that we throw them out altogether. Rather, we should revitalize and adapt for a new era.
James?
Yeah, so let me supplement that rather than argue against it. One is, I would paint, I think, a more realistic picture of how this administration really deals with international organizations. And I think we overly fixate on the president and his rhetoric, and we don't spend enough time looking at the underlying policies. Because generally what we have seen is this Republican administration behaves like most Republican administrations towards international organizations. They tend to be more pragmatic, focused. They're not against international organizations. As a matter of fact, I ran the numbers, and the Trump administration in the first 2 years of its presidency signed about the same number of international agreements as the Obama administration did in its first 2 years. We fixate on very high profile decisions like withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, which I think, quite honestly, Republicans tend to be more skeptical about these engagements than the other side, and they do tend to withdraw from them. So, for example, Republicans get out of the Human Rights Council, Democrats get back in. So, I think in terms of the left and right limits of American engagement in international organizations, it's far less draconian a change than is widely perceived. I actually think that this administration is going to get more engaged in international organizations in the future, not less. We've already seen some signals of that. The United States, well-known, led the campaign against the Chinese candidate for the head of the World International Property Organization. The United States has been very vocal of the International Criminal Court. So I think rather than neglect and withdraw, you actually are going to see the United States engaging in a more proactive and robust manner. And I think that what you've hit on here and the question you raised and what Matt brought up is international organizations are one of the new battlegrounds in great power competition. It's not become about using international organizations to normalize behavior across countries. It's a power struggle, and it is the new battleground between. And what's particularly, I think, animated the U.S. is this is a fight that the Chinese have chosen to take on about using international organizations not to create norms and standards, but to remove obstacles to the growth of Chinese power. And I think you're going to see a very aggressive effort by the United States to push back on that. So rather than walk away from the international community, I think this is where we're actually going to see some of the biggest fights and tussles in the year ahead. This is the new battleground. And people would say, well, what would happen if we had a different outcome in November, we had a different presidency? I'm not sure we would see a dramatic difference. Certainly, again, a Democratic administration, there's more of a willingness to join organizations to try to reform them. But they're, I think, going to be I think any American administration will be deeply concerned about Chinese influence. So I think Matt's model is about right. I've written my colleagues and I wrote an article about this for the National Interest, which I will share on the chat if anybody wants to look at the link. But we painted a model that talks about withdraw, reform, replace. So there are organizations that simply, look, they don't actually do very much, like the international, like the UN Human Rights Council. So withdrawing from that and complaining about it, I think that works fine in the United States. Reform, I think, is a very important tool to bring transparency and accountability. I don't think we're going to be walking away from the World Health Organization and World Trade Organization anytime soon, because those are important institutions that should be reformed. Replace is, I agree with Matt, that's an option, because the problem with international community organizations is everybody gets to play, and everybody doesn't play fair. And maybe there are institutions that in the end you're better off going out and doing it on your own. But I must say, realistically speaking, this would be a long-term effort for the United States. These would probably have to be tree organizations. They wouldn't happen overnight. If this administration wanted to go down that path and they got reelected, they would have to spend the next 4 years laying the groundwork for that. I think in the near term, what we're more likely to see is informal networks that produce kind of like-minded results. So for example, we have the grouping of the Quad Plus in Asia, US, India, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, South Korea. Interestingly, that grouping came out all in support of and leading in WHO reform. We've seen the United States and NATO talk a lot more about NATO having a common position on China. So I think existing and informal networks for now may be the short-term answer, but I agree with Matt. I wouldn't put off the table the notion of creating new institutions in the future, but I think those will take a lot longer to evolve than a lot of people think.
Thank you, James. And for those who are listening us, you can write your questions to the chat box. I started to receive some of the questions. Third question, Matt, we will start with you again. The impact of this COVID-19 crisis to US elections. This is supposed to be the election year, and normally if COVID-19 crisis was not here, we would be probably seeing a lot of Joe Biden and Donald Trump back and forth on TV, but nowadays we are mostly seeing the COVID-19 crisis and its impact to US states. What could be the potential impact of this crisis to US elections?
Well, I'll say a few things. We have political science models of presidential elections, and they show that two things really matter. First, incumbents tend to have an advantage, and second, performance of the economy matters a lot, especially in the third quarter when a lot of undecided voters are starting to make up their minds. And so if you take that model, a few weeks ago or a few months ago, Trump looked to be in a fairly good position, even though despite the fact he's an unconventional candidate. He was an incumbent, the economy was doing very well. And so COVID really challenges that with the worst economic quarter that we've had in many years. And so I think a lot depends on what does this recovery look like. Do we start to turn around this summer or early in the fall and people are feeling good about their economic prospects? Or are we entering into the worst depression since the 1930s, as Dr. Carafano put it earlier. So I think that Trump's chances are not as strong as they were just a few weeks ago. Last thing I'll say, though, is that we saw in 2016 that our political science models of who should win turned out to be pretty poor, and the polls turned out to be pretty poor. We've underestimated Trump in the past, and so I wouldn't put anything past him.
So,
James?
Yeah, this is where I say I work for a nonpartisan think tank, and I don't do politics, and I don't handicap elections and all that. So nothing I have to, and I wouldn't listen to my advice on politics because I'm a policy guy, not a politics guy. But as an observer of the history of American elections, most American elections tend to turn on domestic affairs unless there is a very overwhelming sense of of Americans feeling that the world is impinging upon them. So, for example, the outbreak of the Korean War really convinced Truman not to run for re-election. He wouldn't have won, paved the way for Eisenhower. Same thing in '68 with Johnson, really saying that the Vietnam War had so polarized Americans, it really undercut his political chances. Those were incredibly unusual elections. This doesn't look like one of those. So for all of my friends around the world, I love you, but Americans are not going to vote worried about what's happening to you or them. And you know, unless there is some incredible black swan that we don't know of, a foreign policy that comes in, I think most people agree, including Matt and I, that the results of this are really turned on domestic issues. And clearly, the absolute number one issue is going to be, what does the economy look like in September? That's when Americans really, if you're an undecided voter and you're not in the hardened camps, and we already understand them, that's when Americans will really start to think about this. So we'll be well into the third quarter. You know, it'll turn on issues like what's happening with the unemployment rates. Are they coming down, or are they stubbornly high? Are we starting to see a recovery in the economy? And you know, I think as Matt pointed out, these are just huge unknowns, not just for us, but for everybody. Nobody has ever done this before. I mean, we've had depressions and we've had, you know, recessions, but we've never had a suppression. We've never had a situation where we've all voluntarily just shut our economies down, and now we're just going to throw the on switch. And I don't think anybody is really confident it is what is going to happen. We are all inventing mitigation procedures as we go on COVID. We're inventing on ways to get the economy up and running. It's just so many variables. And you know, September is just so far away that I think I wouldn't certainly feel comfortable if I was a political eye on really handcapping this until I saw what the economy kind of looked like in September.
So over the weekend on Sunday's show, one of top advisors of President Trump, Peter Navarro, said the election will be a referendum on China. Would you agree with that, Matt?
Well, as I said before, and as Dr. Carafano said, I think it'll probably be more a referendum on how people are feeling about their economic circumstances. But I do think that China has become a much more central issue internationally and in US politics. And, you know, this gets to the question of my book, Democracy versus Autocracy and Great Power Competition. Because early on, there were many people saying that the autocracies are handling the situation better, and democracies are slow and gridlocked. And I think over time, we're seeing more and more evidence that China has mismanaged this. You know, the pandemic started in China. The fact that they misled the international community is what led this to become a global pandemic. You see US states like the state of Missouri suing for damages against China. I think Europe is increasingly turning against China because of this pandemic. China's tried to overplay its hand diplomatically in a way that's generating pushback. Much more I could say about this, but I do think that this could be the moment where America's allies and US public opinion really turns against China. And I think that is a part of the goal of the Trump administration now, is to try to turn US domestic opinion, allied opinion against China, because as the administration has said many times, they do see the threat from China as the greatest national security challenge facing the country.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think just hating China is enough to sway the election. Of course, President Trump was incredibly tough on China when he came into office in 2016. I think there's such strong anger about China. I don't think anybody can run on being soft on China in this environment. They would have to say, I'll be tough, maybe in a different way. But again, I think it is going to go down to economic issues, which is why, you know, part of the advice that we've been giving is there is a lot of anger about China, and there are a lot of people that want to do things to China now. And that is, very politically popular in the United States. But if you look at it from the administration's perspective, they have dueling priorities here. Yeah, they make lots of people feel good if we did things to punish or get back at or disengage or whatever from China, but they also have to get the economy up and running. And getting the economy up and running is the key to everything, including dealing with China. And so, when we wrap out saying, well, people want to get back at China or punish or whatever, we said, well, look, think about three things. One is anything you do to punish, disengage, or from China cannot interfere with the economic recovery of the United States and its key friends and allies, because that would be self-defeating. So one is you have to do stuff that's not going to mess with our economic recovery. That, I think, is crucially important. The second one is if you're going to do things to China, do things that get China's attention, not necessarily things that make you feel good. There are lots of people here that would love to do lots of things to China, but to be honest, the Chinese may not really care about that. So I think do substantive things that really matter. So for example, I think investigating the World Health Organization is important because it does, I think, set a line in the sand on dealing with international organizations and make sure they're dealing appropriately. I think it's very important that, the United States is going to have to think long and hard about defense. If there are a lot of people say, well, we need a lot of money for recovery and we've got a lot of debt, so we're going to have to go back to cutting the defense budget. Well, if you wanted to send a signal to China about whether you're serious about protecting your interests or not, if you cut defense and there were less ships in the Pacific, that would be a hell of a lot bigger signal to China than anything else. So how to figure out a strong, resilient defense, not just by the United States, but among key friends and allies, that's going to be pretty crucial. So don't do things that hurt the economic recovery. Do things that get China's attention, not necessarily that make you feel good. And the third set of recommendations is do things that are long-term. I think everybody recognizes that the Chinese deal with these from a long-term perspective. So flash in the pan, make you feel good, toilet paper your girlfriend's car, that kind of stuff, that's not going to work with China. They have to see this as a long-term competitive challenge to them if we're going to get their attention and hopefully change their behavior or mitigate bad behavior. So a good example of this is, there's been a lot of discussion about let's create free market 5G alternatives to Chinese infrastructure. Well, that would pose a real challenge to China and something that would get their attention. But that is not a fly-by-night thing. That is months and years of concerted commitment. And we'd have to see that if we really want to impact China's behavior.
So, gentlemen, we have some more specific questions. I started to receive a lot of questions on China as well. And one of the questions is about the future of US-China relations after the COVID-19 crisis. So if you ask in January, what would be if in December, it was mostly the trade war. In January, we thought that it was resolved. At least there was the first part of the agreement was in line. So we thought it would be possibly South China Sea or other disputes between two countries. So now in the aftermath of, let's say, the first wave of COVID-19 crisis, what do you think would be the state of relations between US and China? And will COVID-19 crisis be as important issue as South China Sea or trade disputes or Taiwan? Matt?
Well, I think some of those issues are related. So just to tie COVID to the South China Sea, I think there are some real possible flashpoints in US-China relations, South China Sea, Taiwan, some others. And so one of the things I've worried about is with these reports that there have been outbreaks of COVID among US forces, with the cancellation of major US military exercises, with announcement that US force movements have been stopped. Does China think that this is an opportunity, that the United States isn't prepared and they can get away with something? Because I think that's the most likely way we see a conflict start, that China thinks that it can take action and the United States won't respond. So I think that would be a mistake if they made that calculation, but I could see how they could talk themselves into that more now than they could a few weeks ago. So I think it is important for the United States to maintain deterrence in this crisis and to make sure through its messaging and maybe through visible movements of forces or other things to demonstrate to the Chinese that we are prepared, that this isn't the time to try to get away with something in Taiwan, the South China Sea, or elsewhere.
James?
Yeah, I'm going to steal a page from Matt's book and also maybe from Colin Dueck, another one of our colleagues who's written very eloquently on great power competition. And that's that I don't think it's just this administration. I think this would have happened eventually anyway. But we've seen essentially a sea change in American policy towards China in terms of great power competition, where for decades we were locked in the debate between the kind of panda huggers and the panda haters about, don't worry, China will normalize, or as China gets more powerful, become more dangerous. And so I think presidents really try to walk this kind of ambiguous middle ground where their argument was, well, let's try to avoid confrontation with China on the most contentious issues. Let's look for areas of consensus building and accommodation and mutual interest. And I think it's largely recognized in the last few years that strategy was failing, that was actually creating space for China to become more aggressive. And I think that the decision that this administration made, which I think actually is relatively bipartisan, is to kind of flip that strategy on its head, which is rather than say, let's avoid confrontation and let's try to accommodate China, let's challenge China, because that's much more likely to get the Chinese attention. Let's find the points of contention between our vital interests and their vital interests and challenge them so they understand where the limits are. And in a sense, that's a better path to stability when we both respect each other's equities. And notions of we don't stand up for our equities, there's no way the Chinese are going to respect that. I remember a very interesting speech that Newt Gingrich was giving to a bunch of ambassadors, the former head of the House, and the Chinese ambassador got up and was waving his finger at him for being so critical of China. And Newt Gingrich said, "Oh, I don't blame you. It's not your fault. We let you take advantage of us. If I were you, I'd have done the same thing." And I think that strategy is in place, and I don't think COVID changes that strategy. I think what's unique about that strategy is it's operated relatively each competition on its own path. So there's a political, diplomatic, economic, international organizations, military. And what we have not seen from the US or actually from the Chinese all that much is much linkage. In other words, so there was never a moment when the US said, well, if you give us a better trade deal, you can have the South China Seas. Or, the administration has tended to keep each competition in its own lane. And because I think it finds that if you have too much linkage, then you wind up tying yourself up and doing nothing. I don't think COVID has changed the administration's calculus, and I don't think they'll part from that strategy. Here's what's different. I think rhetorically, there are some big differences. This administration has always been very fond of kind of good cop, bad cop, where President Trump says nice things about the head of North Korea and the head of China, and meanwhile his policies are actually, or Putin, but his policies are actually very, very tough. Trump kind of plays the good cop, the nice guy, and meanwhile other people are saying, hammering them with the hard policy. What we have seen is a dramatic shift in kind of the high level rhetoric from the U.S. administration. I mean, look. I mean, just practically speaking, it would be, if the president said nice things about China now, that would just seem incredibly unseemly. Americans are just very, very angry. So kind of what we have now is bad cop, bad cop. It's our rhetoric and our policies are tough on China. Here's what I worry about, and I think Matt probably shares this from our conception of great power competition. We want the United States to stand up for its interests. We want us to have common cause with our friends and allies in pushing back on destabilizing activities, but we also don't want to overreach. We don't want to do policies that are so draconian that they're actually undercutting our competitive advantages and impinging on our own interests. So we don't want policies that in turn, in trying to get at China, we wind up hurting ourselves. I actually am hopeful for more cooperation and kind of a common attitude towards China, and more work jointly together. And I think, quite honestly, the global effort organized to go to investigate the World Health Organization is a good example of that. So I mean, we have two very, very camps here, different camps here. We have the China, which is essentially the only country one of the few countries in the world arguing, yes, there should be an investigation, but the WHO should investigate itself, which is a complete joke. And many other countries in the international community saying, no, there has to be an independent investigation. Even the Europeans, while the Europeans haven't said, no, we should investigate China, at least the Europeans are calling for an independent investigation of the WHO. That, I think, is a good show of kind of solidarity of the free world in kind of pushing back on Chinese influence. And I think both Matt and I agree, we'd like to see more American leadership on that. It's more important that we build the solidarity and we think long-term than we're just doing mindless China bashing to make ourselves feel good. Is that fair, Matt? I don't want to mischaracterize you.
No, I think that's exactly right. And, you know, in my book, I talk about some of the strengths the United States has as a democracy. And I think one of our strengths is our network of allies and partners. And I think that's kind of common to democracies throughout history, I try to argue in the book. And so, you know, if it's just the United States against China, looking at GDP as one measure of power, United States is roughly 23% of global GDP, real GDP right now. China roughly 15%, up from only like 9% a decade or so ago. So that's starting to get too close for comfort. If you bring in America's formal treaty allies, that jumps to 59% of global GDP against China's 15%. So I think we still have the preponderance of power if we can work together. So on issues like WHO and global health, the trade war, you know, if it's just not Washington confronting Beijing, but it's the United States sitting down at the same side of the table, it has Europe and Japan with the same problems, suggesting some of the same solutions, I think it's going to be much harder for China to resist. So in a sense, I think we already have the preponderance of power we need for great power competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be a shift. I mean, before it was, let's jointly get together and figure out how we can accommodate China. The conversation has to start with, let's jointly get together and figure out how we can protect our interests and our equities and our values.
James, you actually answered one of the questions that we received about Australia's call for independent investigation. I have another question, a follow-up question about the trade deal, the first stage of the trade deal actually that US and China signed in January had a lot of things about the intellectual property right infringements. And FBI released a statement last week saying that People's Republic of China is targeting COVID-19 research organizations right now. So do you think it would derail the already signed and agreed trade deal, the first stage of the trade deal, or not?
Well, I think that, you know, both sides signed the trade deal because it was a mutual benefit. I think the strategic conditions under which that deal were signed haven't really changed. I suspect, again, with both China and the United States wanting to get on the path of economic recovery, that scrapping, throwing away, completely redoing that trade deal doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, I suspect that there's a lot of rhetoric right now, but both sides would see it at their advantage to proceed with that trade deal. I think that the challenge, and I don't think that's the big fish to fry with the United States either. Essentially going back and scrapping the trade deal, restarting the trade war with China, that would absorb a lot of time and energy that I think the US could and should spend elsewhere. I think the US needs to be a global leader in economic recovery of the free world. So I would much rather see the US putting its energy into what can we redo, what can we do to revitalize the US, Canada, Mexico economic relationship. So moving ahead on the free trade agreement that we've already signed, which is supposed to be implemented this summer. what can we do together with the Europeans on joint economic recovery and trade deals? We can do a trade deal with Taiwan. There are a lot of things that we could do with the what's called the Quad Plus countries in terms of economic development. So I would much rather see the U.S. put its energy there. The administration has this thing called this Economic Prosperity Network. A lot of that is this kind of loose idea about bringing jobs back to the United States. But look, we're never going to make everything in the United States, and we don't need to do that. But there is an argument that says, maybe it would be smarter to do more business with our friends, that would actually lead to a much more stable and productive economy. And so I've been a big fan of, rather than saying, what kind of draconian laws can we pass that don't allow people to do business in China? What kind of free market things can we do that allow us to do business in the United States and encourage us to do business with friends and allies? And I would love to see the U.S. put a lot more of its energy into those relationships than going back and relitigating the trade deal with China.
Matt, that question, and we have another question from our audience. Miyako asks, so what is the US government willing to offer its allies in return for a common front against China?
What is the United States willing to offer?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is a nice situation where there is a commonality of interest and a commonality of values. So on the interest side, many of our allies have the same problems with China that we do. The Japanese, the Europeans have also complained about Chinese unfair trade practices. As Dr. Carafano pointed out earlier, many of our allies are complaining about China's handling of the COVID crisis. They want an independent investigation. Our allies in Asia are concerned about China's growing military power. Allies in Europe. It's amazing. I frequently talk to European officials in my role at the Atlantic Council, and the opinion in Europe has really changed quite a bit over the past 2 years. Just 2 years or so ago, there wasn't a lot of concern with Chinese investments in Europe. Many Europeans saw this as a good thing. I think increasingly they understand the challenge this potentially poses by allowing China to have influence over 5G networks and Belt and Road investments and other things. So I think there is a common concern, and we're coordinating around some of the same policies for addressing it. And on the value side, I think, again, the democracy versus autocracy is, again, a major issue in a way that it wasn't since the Cold War. And I think we see China exporting its values consciously or unconsciously in some areas. And this is also something that's increasingly concerning to our European allies and allies in Asia. So I don't know that, I guess what the United States can offer is leadership, because while these countries share some of the same concerns, they're not going to be able to pull together a global strategy to counter China on their own. I think it falls to the United States as the most powerful country, the leading democracy, to lead a global strategy to try to coordinate our democratic allies to deal with the challenge.
Matt, I will have a follow-up with that before I ask the same question to James. Your book, you talk a lot about the democracy versus authoritarianism, and you mentioned it a couple of times. And there was a lot of debates probably in March, especially when China contained the crisis in Wuhan and start the opening process in April, that actually China handled this better. So it may have something to do with the system of government instead of the capacity or preparedness or anything else. And there were a lot of people who were showing China and the way that China handled the crisis as an example for the European countries, because this was the time when the epicenter of the crisis moved to Italy and then to New York, and which has become more difficult to contain compared to Wuhan. So what would you say to those people who said China's model of handling this crisis might be better than United States or European ones?
Yes. Well, it's one of the things that motivated me to write this book, actually, after the 2008 financial crisis, because back then many people were saying maybe this Chinese state-led authoritarian model is better than the US model. And I was skeptical of that, and so wanted to investigate it over a longer period of time. So ended up researching democratic versus autocratic rivalries starting 2,500 years ago with the Greeks against the Persians up through the present, and came to the conclusion that democracies tend to be more effective. So it's not really a values-based case for democracy, but more of a hard power case for democracy. That democracies are more effective. And I think we've seen something similar in this COVID debate. Many people early on said the autocracies are doing better. I think as more information comes out, we're seeing that that's not the case. And I suspect with the benefit of hindsight, we'll conclude that the democracies, in fact, did better. And so just a few data points on how did China do on the public health aspect. I mean, first, the fact that they tried to hide and lie about the pandemic is what made what could have been a small outbreak into a global pandemic. So big negative points there. And then also on just how well they did in terms of handling it within China. There was new data leaked last week from the Chinese National Defense University to Foreign Policy magazine that showed that the number of cases in China was 10 times the official amount. So I think we still don't know the full ramifications inside China. So that's on the public health side. On the economic side, China is reporting its worst economic numbers since the 1960s. And so I think that poses real problems. The United States, at least as a capitalist system, has experience with boom and bust cycles. We've been through this before, so we're suffering economically as well, but we've been through these kind of cycles. China has never been through these kind of cycles. It's been remarkably steady growth since the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. So will they be able to recover economically? Maybe, although they haven't proven an ability to go through a major downturn like this and recover. And I think this raises real questions about the domestic political model in China as well. For many decades, China's model has been essentially for the Communist Party to say, don't ask questions about politics, we'll provide you with continued economic growth. And for the most part, that has worked. But what happens if China can't promise that growth? Again, worst economic numbers in decades. Does that begin to unravel this kind of bargain within China? So I think China is entering a very difficult and really unprecedented period. And I think it's way too early to conclude that they've done better. And I certainly wouldn't trade places with China.
James, both questions to you. What U.S. government offers to the allies at this point, given that there is some crisis about the trust to U.S., especially for the last 2 decades for different reasons. And secondly, the democracies and authoritarian regimes. And does the handling of the crisis have something to do with the regime type or not?
Well, I would say that American leadership is important. And I think neither Matt or I say that because we're Americans and we're proud of Americans and America is exceptional and we love apple pie and mom and the statue of that. And not that we're better than everybody else. It's just Matt and I are both realists and we're just proponents of hard power. And, the golden rule, the guy with the gold makes the rules and, the guy with the big stick, gets to bang first. So the United States is a global power with global interests and responsibilities. And I think if the United States does not stand up for its interests against China, why would we expect any other country to? And I would point to, I think, a good example of American leadership here. I think obviously very controversial about the president's announcement that we were going to withdraw funds from the World Health Organization. But let's be honest, that was a galvanizing move. If the United States stood up and said, we are not comfortable with this, that really encouraged and gave space for other countries to stand up and show opposition as well. I mean, we can't roll the clock back, but I wonder if the United States had just ignored the WHO issue, would anybody else in the world have had the courage to really stand up and start to beat the drum on this? I'm not sure they would have. So I do think American leadership is important. Beyond that, I would, in a sense, turn the question on its head. I think it's particularly wrong to ask this administration, what are you going to do for me? I think the question is what can we do together that's efficacious in not just dealing with China, but with all the other destabilizing forces and great power competition? I think one good example of that is the 3 Seas initiative in Central Europe. The United States wants to invest in 3 Seas. We're not giving money away. We're making an investment. We hope there's a return on those dollars. But that is building up the infrastructure of Central Europe. Is going to help the Central European economy. It's going to help Europe as a whole. It's going to help push back on the destabilizing influence of Russia. It offers an alternative to Chinese financing. The countries in the region are participating in putting money into that. Hopefully the European Union will. Hopefully Germany will. That's something we can do together, making NATO strong. A strong NATO that just pushes back on the destabilizing influence of Russia and really protects Europe from the problems of the Middle East bleeding over into and destabilizing Western Europe. But the stronger NATO is, the more resources and capabilities the United States can allocate to dealing with China in other theaters. So I do think, just like when we say COVID, we're all in this together. In great power competition, we're all in this together. And I've said this in other forums, is I think the term "the free world," in the broadest sense of the term, is going to make a comeback. Fundamentally, we believe in governments elected by their people. We believe in free enterprise and free markets, and we believe in fundamental human rights. The Chinese Communist Party does not believe in any of those things. Indeed, they see those things as an obstacle to the growth and the influence of China. That's not to say that we are intractable enemies and that this is an existential conflict, but I think the reality is if the nations of the world that believe in elected governments, that believe in free enterprise and human rights, if they don't stand together as a group to protect those equities, what do they think is going to happen to them? So again, I do think there are large parts of the world where, we have to pick a side. We can't be Switzerland. I don't even think Switzerland in this confrontation with China can be Switzerland. And again, it doesn't mean we're not going to do business with China. I think everybody's going to do business with China. I don't have a problem with doing business with China, but I think we have to be realistic on it. And in the end of the day, we have to recognize whose side we were on if we want to continue to live in a rules-based order, if we want to live in a world that's free, if we want to live with our freedom of the commons, freedom of transit the oceans, freedom of space. We have to make some fundamentally hard choices. And I know they're very, very difficult for many, many countries. How does the U.S. helps best by one, leading, and by two, offering to work with others for our mutual interest.
You mentioned NATO, and we got a question from you from Istanbul. Mustafa Kibaroğlu, a professor from MEF University in Istanbul, asked, Mr. Carafano, in the Daily Signal on May 4th, you write the problems of the Middle East may spill over into and destabilize Europe. Thus, to confront all those very real possibilities, NATO needs to have the capacity and capability to look and act south towards the Middle East. Should this be the case, and where do you see Turkey's role in this?
Look, I think Turkey is an absolutely vitally important ally to the United States. And I think the United States is a vitally important ally to Turkey. Two of our most, I think from a regional perspective, our critical, vital national interests are, we want a peaceful and stable Western Europe, peaceful and stable Middle East, and a peaceful and stable Indo-Pacific. NATO is critical, certainly to the peace and stability of Western Europe. Turkey is a critical component of NATO, and Turkey is a critical force in the region. So the United States and Turkey, I think, are countries that have deep strategic alignment. Again, it doesn't, I think, it doesn't matter what the relationship with Russia or Iran or anything is. It's in our mutual self-interest. Both of us want a stable Europe and a stable Middle East. And the reality is that can only happen if the two countries fundamentally cooperate together on the basics of policy. I think Syria is actually a good example where I think the US and Turkey have actually done more to try to accommodate each other's interests, bring some stability to the region, and help ameliorate some of the suffering. And that's a very, very difficult, complicated issue. And I would hope that in some ways would be a pace setter for what we would do in the future.
Thank you, Matt. There's a question about Secretary Pompeo's tweet about Taiwan today. There's a hashtag going on supporting Taiwan's participation to World Health Organization. Secretary Pompeo posted a tweet praising Taiwan's response to the COVID-19 crisis. Do you expect any change in US policy to Taiwan after this crisis? Because there has been a lot of debate about who handled the crisis better, Taiwan or China, in Washington.
Yes. Well, first, I just agree with Dr. Carafano and his response to Professor Mustafa, Professor, I met him a couple of years ago, so good to hear him. You know, I'd agree. There's some in Washington now who say that, you know, certain allies, Hungary, Turkey, others are, you know, have differences with the United States, and there's some truth to that. On the other hand, I think this is a time to keep our allies. And so I think we should be working closely with Turkey on some of our shared interests. And we can have difficult discussions and should have difficult discussions behind closed doors. But I don't think either of us have an interest in rupturing the relationship. On Taiwan, I think we've already seen a change in policy on Taiwan. You know, I guess the core of the Taiwan policy, I think, has not changed, which is that the United States opposes unilateral action by either side to change the status quo. And so I think the United States would continue to oppose Taiwan independence, would also continue to oppose China trying to forcibly reunify the country. But within that broad framework, there's a lot of wiggle room. Do you allow US officials to visit Taiwan? At what level? And already I think we've seen the Trump administration working more closely with Taiwan. And I haven't seen Secretary Pompeo's speech today, but I think supporting Taiwan for membership in the WHO would be another example of that. Because in a way, this relationship makes a lot of sense. Taiwan does have shared interests with the United States, is an example of a successful open market democracy in Asia. This is exactly the kind of country that the United States should be working with more closely. So I'll look forward to reading the Pompeo speech when we.
James, do you want to add anything to this Taiwan policy?
Well, if you look over the long term, what we have seen is when the United States supports Taiwan very strongly, Taiwanese-Beijing relations actually tend to improve. And reason for that is once Beijing gets over being angry, it realizes that being more respectful and having a more constructive relationship with Taiwan is more constructive. When the United States, I think, undervalues or diminishes its support for the relationship, I think we've seen Beijing feel more emboldened and more impressive and more aggressive against Taiwan. So our goal is peace and stability in Northeast Asia. That is a critical cornerstone in the Indo-Pacific. The last thing that the United States wants is a war in North Korea or a military intervention in Taiwan. Those are the two nightmare scenarios. What our American policy has traditionally done is, since the 1950s, is by demonstrating our resolve to allies in the region, we raise the price of intervention and conflict so high that nobody wants to go there. And I think the answer is we need to continue to do that because it's actually in our interest to do that. I mean, Northeast Asia is really the anchor of American power in Asia. Our relationship with Japan, South Korea, that's what really anchors America as a power in the Indo-Pacific. Without Japan and South Korea and Hawaii, it's a long walk from California to the Asian mainland. So geopolitically, a stable Northeast Asia is vital to the United States, and the stronger a U.S. commitment we make to that, what we found is the more stable the region has been. So my expectation is again, regardless of the outcome of the election in November, that U.S. commitment to Taiwan is not going to dramatically reverse. It's also, I don't think, going to get overly aggressive. I mean, that was kind of, I think, the lesson of the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, I mean, arguably America overreached. We wound up fighting a very debilitating war with very little strategic advantage. So the key to great power competition, again, read Matt's book or Colin Dueck's book, is you want to, when you compete for the long term by spending as much effort protecting your strengths as you do trying to push back against the other guy. And so you want to find that balance of consistent application of power over time that just convinces the other guy that, you know, trying to upset the balance is just not worth it. And I think American commitment to Taiwan is a crucial part of maintaining stability in the Indo-Pacific.
I know our time is almost up, but I have a few questions. I want to ask those questions as well. Sangmin Lee asked, we have been told China plays crucial role in dealing with North Korea issues, and so US need to have good coordination and cooperation with China in order to solve North Korea problems. But current worsening relations of US-China seems to give bad impact on dealing with North Korea issue to the US side. Can you tell me your thought about the impact of current US-China relations to North Korea issues? Gentlemen, who wants to go first?
Yeah, this will be a short answer.
Sure.
I just don't think that's true. China has vital interests in North Korea. Essentially, what China wants is North Korea's got to be stable, doesn't want to see it fall into the Western camp. That's, I mean, at the end of the day, the Chinese are happy for that. That means they don't want to see a war. They don't want to see North Korea destabilized. They don't want to see North Korea and South Korea merge together. But beyond that, I think they're done there. So they have a baseline interest that that they would be very opposed to be seeing compromised. But beyond that, I don't think they're willing to invest a lot more or give up a lot more to get anything. So I actually think that at the end of the day, if North Korea denuclearized, the Chinese would actually be okay with that. But on the other hand, I think China has, you know, no interest in actually investing a lot in that. So the notion that somehow the success of our bilateral relations with North Korea are dependent on our relationship with China, yeah, I don't think that's true.
Matt, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, in a way, I think actually a tougher line with China can help in North Korea for this reason. If we're going to get Kim Jong-un to seriously discuss denuclearization, I think we're going to have to convince him that hanging on to nuclear weapons might actually be more dangerous for him than giving them up. To do that, we're going to have to bring really severe regime destabilizing levels of pressure. And the only way to do that is to begin to cut off some of the economic activity between China and North Korea. Something like 80% of North Korean trade comes via China. So China's been unwilling to really crack down on that cross-border trade for some of the reasons Dr. Carafano mentions. One of the ways the United States can try to begin to do that is through secondary sanctions directly against the Chinese banks and Chinese firms engaging in and supporting that trade. For many years, the United States was unwilling to do that because it was afraid of antagonizing China. And so given that we are in a more confrontational posture now, I think there may be more leeway for secondary sanctions against Chinese firms and banks, which could actually increase the pressure on North Korea.
One last question. Actually, Dan asked three questions, and I see that Matt answered some of them. Dan asked, considering the number of continuous wars, insurrections, rise of terrorism, and massive refugees and migrations, can we conclude that the New World Order outlined after World War II has ever been successful? James?
Well, when you look at where we were in 1945, and even where we are today, it's very, very difficult to argue that humanity isn't way, way better off. That there's more freedom in successive generations than we've ever seen. There's more prosperity in generations. There are more democracies. Just look at the difference between how the world has dealt with this and 1908, the pandemic of 1917, 1918, millions and millions of people died. and we went into one of the worst periods of depression and global retrenchment that we've ever seen in our history. Right now, the world's way better off dealing with a global pandemic than it was in 1914. So I guess I'm the optimist in the room. I think that I agree with Matt. I think in the end, democracies are more resilient. They're more creative. They're more innovative, and they tend to be more resilient, and they tend to be more productive over time. And I do think the proliferation of democracies post 1945 and stronger independent nation states has actually leaves us in a much better position to deal with this great power competition than any great power competition that we've seen in modern history.
Matt?
Well, since you went to Dr. Carafano first, it gave me time to look up some data from this report I mentioned, present at the recreation. And so looking at peace, from 1600 until 1945, between 1 to 2% of the world population died in wartime casualty. After 1945, that dropped to 0.4%. Since 2000, that's less than 0.01%. So by that measure, a much more peaceful world than any time in world history. Looking at global GDP per capita, 1945, it was about $1,000 a person. Currently, it's almost $7,000 a person. So world's much more prosperous today than it was in 1945. And looking at freedom around the world in 1945, there were about 10 democratic countries on Earth. Today, there are almost 100. So if you care about peace, prosperity, and freedom, I think this post-world order has been better than any previous system we've ever seen in world history. So could we do better? I think so. Let's try. But I think this has been a pretty good system, and we don't want to see it go away.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. One very last question. I need a very short answer about that. I'm looking at the Pew Research survey published on April 21st, 2020, a month ago, and there is an increasing negative views on China, and I see that around 80% of those who responded started to see China as a threat. Do you think this increasing negative opinion on China will change the US policy? Would it get any impact on the US foreign policy decision making? Matt?
Well, I'm a political scientist by training. I'm a professor of political science at Georgetown. And one thing on public opinion experts tend to find on American public opinion on foreign policy is the bumper sticker is essentially that there's not a public opinion on foreign policy, that most Americans just aren't that informed on foreign policy issues. And so they tend to follow the cues of elites. And so having not studied this in detail, my guess is that this may be kind of the arrows are going the other direction, that there is a national elite level consensus now that China is a problem, that we need to have a much tougher policy. That's being communicated very clearly by Pompeo and others. And I think that's beginning to affect public opinion. But I think the bottom line is that there is more of a consensus now on the China challenge, on the return of great power rivalry, than there has been on US foreign policy challenges in the recent past.
James?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think China believes the data, which is why I think they're acting very aggressive. And now as brand China has taken a tremendous hit, and the Chinese are desperately lashing out to try to figure out some ways to recover. And I think that explains a lot of current Chinese behavior, which I think is as much out of fear and a reaction as opposed to thinking that they've got control of all this. So I think China's worried about how the world views China. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James. Thank you, Matt. And thank you for our audience. And we will have another panel on Syria this time, COVID crisis, and how it influenced the policy on Syria this week. And hope to see you there as well. Thanks again. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.